Thank you so much to everyone who has reached out. I really appreciate these. It gives me a reason to consider doing these every week and helping everyone out there answer some of the questions around technology. Now, this week has been brewing for quite some time. Many of you have asked questions around compliance changes, boards, what do they need to be mindful of around cybersecurity? And to be fair with you, I have been trying to cultivate a really good response, but in so doing, I've brought on an absolute stellar guest this week. David Morrison from Morrisec is going to join me today to go through some of these really tedious questions that you've been asking. So without further ado, let me introduce David to the call. Dave, how are you going?
Awesome. How you doing?
Very well, mate. Very well. Pumped to be here. Thanks for joining me. I know that there has been a ton of questions. You and I have spoken about this over the last few weeks around boards. And look, cybersecurity, I don't need to talk about cybersecurity. Everyone has got a blaringly big flashlight at them over the last couple of months, especially when we talk about from last year. We've got those headline cases of Medibank, Optus. I don't even need to go into Latitude Financial, right? So let's sort of take this back a step before we start going any further into that board conversation, and let's go back to the key one. So one of the questions we've had recently is, what are the key cybersecurity standards relevant in Australia? Right. I mean, that's probably the fundamental flaw. Let's start there.
Okay, that's a long list to start with, so I'll probably start at the top. I used to get a lot of, when I was meeting with clients, it doesn't happen as much anymore, but a lot of them would go, you'd ask them the question, what compliance standards do you have to align with? And they would be like, none. I don't actually have any because they're not in financials and other stuff. And then you drill into it. One that just sits with everyone is, the Australian Privacy Act and the APPs. If you store any sort of personal information, you fall under that act. And then you have the notifiable data breach enactment off the back of that as well. So if you actually have a breach, you've got to notify that OAIC and that. So that's number one on there. Staying on privacy, you're looking at GDPR as well, even though it's not an Australian standard. If you've got any sort of EU citizen information or deal with any of those clients, you save any of that information, you fall under that as well. So there's different requirements under GDPR versus under the Australian Privacy Act as well. Recently, we've had updates to the Australian Security and Critical Infrastructure Act, so the SOCI Act. So that's come out, a lot of requirements around having a risk management process in place, having your asset register defined, and then incident response plans and all that stuff as well, which you think would be, pretty core to any organization anyway. So, but it's good having that in place. If you're looking at financial services, looking at APRA, CPS 234 is a big one. There's a lot of tripartite audits that are happening out of APRA at the moment. We're dealing with a lot of clients in that space and helping them fix up gaps there, which is good. If you process any sort of credit card information, you've got Payment Card Industry Data Security Standards, PCI DSS, which has been around forever.
Yep.
So there's that one that falls into there. The other big one that comes up as well is the ASD Essential 8. So, if you're a government agency, you fall under that. And there's quite a big push from a lot of consultancies to, push normal corporations into that side of stuff as well, which is an interesting one. But what people don't realize as well is like ASD Essential 8 is fantastic. Like it's great controls and everything else, but it is specifically designed for Windows environments. It's designed for internet-facing Windows environments. If you actually go to cyber.gov.au, one of the first disclaimers on there is saying it is for Windows environments. And if you fall outside this, you should be looking at other frameworks and standards because it doesn't cover stuff like people risk.
Correct.
Which is the highest risk we have at the moment.
One of the worst things about the ASD Essential 8 is exactly what you mentioned, right? If you have a Linux device, a Mac OS or anything like that, it sort of falls out of that realm of how its control mechanisms are supposed to be utilized. Look, that is just one of the tips, right? There are quite a few more we could go into, and I do make mention that the Essential 8 isn't a framework; it's a set of category controls that could be applied.
Exactly.
ISO, NIST are actual frameworks, so they're certainly there. But let's get to this burning question because it is one that I have been asked, and I mean repeatedly over the last 3 weeks. And thank you everyone for sending this through. It's a big one. What are the current responsibility of boards in Australia, specifically around cybersecurity?
Their responsibility is cybersecurity. That's the biggest takeaway from it. So if you think back, a couple of 100 years, boards have been looking after enterprise risk, financial risk, any sorts of other compliance risk. Cybersecurity is just another form of risk, and it falls under there. So that's their responsibility. Under things like APRA, it specifically says it is the board's responsibility. But if you look at any other standard like ISO 27001 and any of the other ones, they specifically talk about roles and responsibilities that has to come down from the top, that they are responsible for. So that's the key thing, is that they're the ones that need to understand cybersecurity risk. They need to be able to address it and make sure it's being managed properly. Because if they don't, you end up with, you've got the couple you mentioned before. You've got the Medibank ones recently, and Optus, where we're now looking at class action suits that are coming up against them. So, which massive impacts to them. The 250 million capital charge has been put onto Medibank.
Yeah.
Most organisations, it's fine for Medibank, they've got enough cash there, but for most organisations, they couldn't wear that sort of hit.
And that is the scary point, and you make a really, really strong point there, is that it's not just about revenue loss that an organisation will have through the cyber breach. It is the ongoing loss of staff, because staff will want to, what do they say, act with their feet in that event. They probably won't want their resume to reflect a heavily criticised breach. You will also get the ongoing effect where vendors will seriously scrutinise. And I will get to a bit about that in the next couple of questions, because I guess one of the key questions that we keep getting asked is also, what should boards be asking, right? You've talked about the fact that cybersecurity is a board's responsibility, but what are the questions they really should be asking them, both from a management perspective, but also from their tech teams?
Yeah, so I think the first thing to cover is what not to ask. And one of the questions that you see boards have always asked is like, how secure are we? And that's a pretty broad question, and realistically, it's not that measurable. So I can't tell you how secure you are. You can go through your controls and have a look at everything else, but if you've got a threat actor who's targeting you, nation state or someone else with a lot of skills, how secure are you? You should be asking, and this comes back to, I follow a guy called Kristof on LinkedIn, and he's always posting about it's not if but when, and that goes to the whole, how resilient are we? Is a much better question. Is we've got the security controls in place, but are we going to actually be able to recover? And if we do recover, how fast can we recover? What's the impact going to be? Because you can start talking about dollar values when you start talking about that, which the board understands.
Yeah, it's a really scary topic, right? If it is no longer, it's when, right? And to your point, actionable outcomes. I mean, we've talked about a lot previously. I mean, you and I have spoken about this, incident response plans, right? They are so crucial. And there's a reason why insurance policies ask for you to have one. And the majority of those, let's talk about cyber insurance plans, will ask for a number of things along the way, because obviously they've had some experience. I mean, cyber insurance has vastly come 360 over the last 2 years. I mean, we've seen insurance policies being redacted and cancelled because people weren't meeting certain criteria now. But that comes back to the burning question, right, around incident response and disaster recovery plans, right? So you mentioned that briefly, but what do organizations need to be prepared for, and what response do they need to do in the event of this sort of event?
So I've actually been doing a fair bit with clients at the moment. I've got one next week around crisis management around ransomware, because that's quite a common one. And you talked about incident responses. A lot of organizations don't have an asset register, what we call an information asset register, that has all of your critical information. What the criticality, the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of those devices are, how critical they are to the business, and the downtime you can actually afford to have, your RTOs and RPOs and all the other things that you do out of your DR plans. So understanding what you have and what you're trying to protect, and the impact on your business if they're taken offline as well, if that data is unavailable. That's the key parts. And then you can start building out those BCPs and the DR plans and your crisis management. But then one of the key things that a lot of organizations miss, and we see this all the time, is they don't actually test the plans. Now, whether that's a live technical simulation to see if they can actually recover and bring stuff up, or tabletop ones where you're running through and asking those questions. We do a lot of ransomware ones with executives and also the IT teams and everything else, which is, I always call it a facilitated discussion, because we actually talk about, it's not a matter of, are you going to pay the ransom or not pay the ransom? It's what are all the implications of whether you do, legal implications, reputational implications. Are the threat actors actually going to give your data back? Are they still going to release stuff on the dark web and sell it? Like, there's so many things to think about, and that's the stuff that you need to have thought about before you're in that situation. Because if you're getting hammered and you've got a ransom like right there, then you've got to make those decisions under that pressure. You're going to make different types of decisions, and you may make the wrong decision. If you've pre-thought that and you've pre-discussed that with the relevant parts of the business, communication plans. What happens, how are you going to notify the public and your customers and your clients about the breach? These are all critical components that people don't think about. And they're all part of your resilience.
You make a really good point there. It's one of those things, if you consider a scenario and have a calm approach at the time where you're making those decisions, it's a very different outcome. For example, when you are under pressure, I'll take this as an example for the Matildas fans out there, all of us watching the Women's World Cup. Obviously you can practice thousands of times hitting a ball in a certain manner, but when it comes to the crunch time and you're under pressure, you may not respond the exact same way. And this is exactly the same thing about a cyber event. So you make such a great point around that. It's taking the time to be able to think through logistically when you're not stressed and when you're not under that pressure, to go, well, what do I really want and how do I respond?
And you've got time to find those gaps as well. You've got time to reach out to different parts of the organization you might not have thought about. Who looks after your cyber insurance? Have you actually looked at it to work out, if we pay the ransomware, are we going to get any money back? Is it going to be null and void? Or is the threat actor that's attacking us actually excluded? Like Lloyd's of London, last year came out with, they're not going to pay any insurance off the back of nation state attacks, which brings a whole nother side to it, because that's the whole attribution part of it, is like, who's a nation state actor? Yeah. So it all gets, there's a lot of questions in here. Like, you could run these workshops for like 5 days and still not cover everything.
Yeah. So, you know what? Yeah, it's look, it boggles my mind. It is scary, right? I mean, again, the best defense is obviously being prepared. So, and thank you so much for bringing that up. That is a very valid point. So let me flip the coin here, because obviously this is sort of, we talk about cybersecurity and we hear the generic AI conversations. We hear about all these beautiful new technologies that are emerging, like quantum computing, which actually has been around forevermore. It's just so now prominent. AI, everyone speaks about ChatGPT. Oh, it's the newest and greatest. It has had predecessors before, but it's now becoming the light. So tell me, what do the organizations need to be mindful about in analyzing the security risks associated with these technologies?
This is exactly it. It's around risk management. Is we need to be agile. We want to use technologies. We want to use AI, because the benefits far outweigh, the negative side of stuff. But this is what we get back to, where you need to have effective risk management plans that address all of these bits. You don't just go, okay, we're going to ban ChatGPT because it's a risk that people might pay stuff into there. It's a matter of, what are the benefits? It's always risk reward discussion. Like, what are the benefits we're going to get from it? What are the actual risks, and how do we address those risks? There's going to be stuff around user education. Are there there's always process controls and there's technical controls, and most of the time, technical controls don't cut it. If it did, if we could just put technical controls in, then the internet would be safe. But it doesn't work that way, because we've got people and we've got processes and everything as well. So we need those other controls. So it's not one or the other. It's a hybrid mixture of both. So I'm sure there's going to be technologies that will come out that will help identify data being put into AI systems, having your own internal versions of it and stuff like that, which some companies do have access to.
And what you make an interesting point is that it sounds horrible when we say we need to protect against ourselves. but it is exactly that point, right? I mean, over 90% of breaches occur by human error. And that's simply that whole concept of think before you click. Don't just assume.
And
Right?
I do a lot of risk assessments with different organizations, and the biggest risks that we get out of it, they're always people risks, and it's people doing stuff that they're not trying to do anything malicious. They're not doing anything accidentally. They just are trying to do their job. Like, everyone's time poor. Everyone's trying to get stuff in on time and get all of their things done. And they might take shortcuts that speed up the process. Someone might look at ChatGPT and go, "Oh, I can speed up and get this done in 1 hour versus 8 hours. I'll just use this." But they don't, because they're not a security person. They don't think about the consequences of it because they don't know. And that's where that whole education piece comes in. And we always find the biggest thing that comes out of risk assessments is finding how people are misusing technology or data or things that they're doing. And it's never malicious. It's always just they're trying to do their job. They just don't realize the ramifications for the business they work with and the risk they're putting in.
Yeah. Look, and it is a sad scenario. I mean, there are some simple controls that can help with some of this. I mean, we've talked about password hygiene, for example, and there are a ton of ways. If you are interested in these top tips, feel free to comment below. I will send you the top tips around password hygiene. The dark web is representative of over 80% of the actual internet. What you see and what you can access doesn't even represent 20% of the internet. So you need to be mindful about what you do online. And you make a really good point on that one. So we did circle past this, and I thought I'd bring this one back because it is something that's becoming really important. We're talking about supply chains, right? And we have seen a number of supply chains starting to be breached to get to a certain target. Now, how do we assess and manage the risk associated with these third parties and vendors and supply chains?
Yeah. So third-party vendor assessments, third-party risk management, whatever you want to call it, is like critical for most organizations now. Is it goes back to what I was talking about before around risk assessments. Is it's risk assessments for your vendor. The problem is getting the right information and then being able to process that information as well. So perfect example is, you'll go out to organizations and they'll send you a whole stack of information that's fantastic. And it looks really good on paper, but you don't really know what they're doing behind the scenes. So a perfect example recently is dealt with a third-party vendor who had probably the best security documentation I've seen. It was really, really good. I contemplated taking the structure of it for some of the stuff we do. It was that good. And then cross-referencing that with a recent pen test that had, when you put the two things next to each other, it's like, well, the root cause of these vulnerabilities in the pen test go completely against what they've got in the documents. So you've got to have someone that has the ability to be able to look at the processes, look at technology, look at the risks, look at vulnerabilities, and then be able to cross-reference and see how all those pieces fit together, which is difficult in itself. There's products out there where you can scan vendors and you can get some good information, but it's a matter of dealing with those vendors and be able to get that information out of them and then work out where they're not bending the truth, not telling the truth, or you might be meeting with the wrong people and just don't have the information. That they think that they're doing something and maybe the developers or someone else isn't doing it, which was the case with this vendor I was dealing with. They had secure development processes, but obviously some of the developers weren't following certain parts of it, and that was creating vulnerabilities in the system, which now we've found that and now they've fixed it and it's all good. So, but it takes someone to be able to, it's not an easy thing to do. And, not every organization can afford to, hire security consultants to come in and do assessments on, 50 vendors. So
you make a really interesting point, and this is, I guess, goes back to that independent view, right? And that's the whole thing. It is wonderful to, as you said, go through. You've got your security compliance document. Sometimes just getting that external third-party view on that can be all the difference because it points out to your exact scenario that you've spoken about, right? One or two controls just aren't being followed.
Yeah, and it's those one or two that just destroy you. So yeah.
Well, so landscape.
Exactly.
We've come to the end of some of the questions. I know there are a couple of extra questions that we will answer. In fact, I might even do a follow-up session with you at some point soon, David. And thank you so much for joining today. I need to ask, you have the most amazing mascot for your organization. Please share, people, what it looks like. How cute is that? I've actually asked for one. What's he called?
Maury.
Maury.
We have two robots. We have Maury and we have Dr. Bot, who's his arch nemesis. But secretly, we know they're friends. So,
if you want one of those, like I do, please reach out to David and contact him. His description is in the link dip just above here. So feel free to ask any questions that you have. Drop them in the comments below. David and I will be getting to them. As you guys may be aware, I can't get to them immediately because after the live, we have about a 15-minute delay. At that point, we will get to your questions. As always, thank you so much for joining me, David. These were absolutely fantastic answers.
It's great. Thank you.
Nugget of gold that you would leave with people just as a little tidbit.
That's a difficult one. You didn't ask me that one. I didn't prepare for that one.
I know.
I think the key thing, going back to what we're doing around boards and stuff here, is getting the right information to the boards. We need to understand that the majority of board members don't have a cybersecurity background. There's been some recent studies out of the US and stuff where I think it was 90% of public listed companies had less than like one person who actually had some sort of cyber experience. So giving them, malware statistics and an endpoint and all these other things that don't mean anything to them, it's got to talk business to them.
Yeah.
So they need to understand business risk, not technical risk.
That is one of the best nuggets of gold I think we've heard. So thank you so much for that.
Nice.
As always, people, please feel free to send your comments, questions, etc. I love answering them for you in these sort of forums. And until next week, as always, look forward to seeing you guys online and answering your questions. Thanks again, David. Have a fantastic weekend.
You too. See ya.